Fade in. A slow, eerie violin note lingers in the background. The voiceover begins, calm yet chilling. In the autumn of 1842, the town of Salem, Massachusetts was no stranger to whispers of the strange. Its cobblestone streets carried the weight of history, a town forever haunted by the infamous witch trials of the 17th century. Though more than a century had passed since the gallows last claimed the accused, Salem remained a place where superstition lingered in the corners of every home, and the memory of witchcraft was never truly buried. It was in this uneasy silence, amid the creaking ships of Salem Harbor and the candlelit rooms of Puritan-descended families, that the town awoke to a sound unlike anything they had ever known. A scream. Not a cry of terror. Not the fleeting shriek of a startled woman. But a sound that seemed to claw its way out of the human soul itself. They said it began one night in late September, when the leaves had only just begun to turn. Residents near Charter Street were roused from their sleep by a high, piercing wail. Some assumed it was the cry of a woman in childbirth. Others thought it the desperate shriek of someone being attacked. Yet as shutters flew open and lanterns lit the street, no danger could be found. Only her. A woman in her early 30s, standing barefoot in the dirt, her nightgown clinging to her as if soaked with sweat. Her mouth open wide, her throat straining, her body trembling with the force of the sound. She did not cry out words. No pleas for help. No warning of fire or intruder. Only that scream, endless, raw, and unearthly. The neighbors tried to calm her. 2 men rushed to hold her shoulders, but she fought with a strength unnatural for her size. A priest was summoned. A physician soon after. Yet no one could silence her. Hours passed. The woman collapsed, her body trembling violently. They thought her voice would give way, that her lungs would surrender, but as soon as she inhaled, the scream began again. And by morning, Salem had a new terror. The narrator's tone deepens, soft yet deliberate. Imagine the horror of a sound that never ceases. A cry so piercing it bleeds into every dream, every waking moment. Imagine a voice that refuses to quiet, not for sleep, not for hunger, not for prayer. The people of Salem soon called her only one name, the woman who never stopped screaming. Her true identity was whispered. Some claimed she was Mary Elkins, the widow of a sailor lost at sea. Others insisted she was the daughter of a preacher, punished by God for a sin untold. But official records from that autumn tell us little. Her name shifts in each account, yet the phenomenon remains the same. From that night forward, the woman screamed without end. Doctors attempted laudanum. Priests attempted exorcism. Families attempted mercy. But no matter what was tried, the sound continued. At first, neighbors pitied her. They brought bread, warm broth, blankets for the nights when her body convulsed from exhaustion. But pity soon gave way to dread. For the scream did not remain behind her walls. It carried across Salem, echoing through the alleys, seeping into homes, rattling window panes in the dead of night. Children cried themselves to sleep. Horses spooked in the street. The elderly prayed aloud at their doorsteps, crossing themselves as if against a plague. And then came the first death. An old woman, bedridden and frail, passed away just a week after the screams began. Her daughter swore that her mother's final moments were spent, clutching her ears, begging for silence. Soon after, a young boy fell ill with fever, his parents blaming the unholy cries that rattled through their thin walls. Within days, he too was gone. The people began to wonder, was it possible that the scream itself was killing them? The narrator pauses, allowing silence to stretch. This is where the story turns from tragedy into terror. For the scream of one woman became something more than sound. It became a curse, a haunting presence that infected the minds and hearts of all who lived within earshot. Some claimed they heard it even when she was not near. A fisherman swore that out at sea, miles from Salem, he could still hear the wail on the wind. Travelers said the roads into town carried an unnatural echo, a sound like tearing flesh carried between the trees. And still, the woman screamed. Days turned into weeks. Her throat should have been ruined. Her lungs should have failed. Yet somehow, she lived, her voice sharp, her body withering, her eyes wide and glassy as though she saw something no one else could. When a journalist from Boston visited in October, he described her in his notebook as a creature possessed, whose shriek comes not from the lungs of a mortal but from some chasm in hell itself. His notes were later discovered spattered with ink, the final line trembling off the page, "It does not stop. God help us, it does not stop." The narrator lowers their voice, a whisper that forces the listener to lean in. And so the question remains, echoing across centuries. Who was she? What caused her to scream without ceasing? Was it grief? Madness? A sickness no physician could name? Or was it, as many feared, something darker? The voice of Salem's cursed history finding its way into flesh once more? What we do know is this. In the autumn of 1842, Salem became a place of unending sound. A place where one woman's voice fractured the minds of neighbors, drove families from their homes, and left a shadow so deep it has never truly lifted. And tonight, we will follow her story. The story of a scream that time could not silence. The story of the woman who never stopped screaming. To understand the horror of the woman who never stopped screaming, we must first understand the world into which she screamed. The year was 1842. Salem, Massachusetts, no longer stood at the height of its colonial fame. Once a thriving seaport, bustling with ships carrying exotic spices, silks, and teas from distant lands, the town was now a quieter, humbler shadow of its former self. By the mid-19th century, Salem's great maritime power had begun to fade, outshined by Boston and New York. The docks that had once been filled with the creak of timber and the songs of sailors now stood eerily silent, with only a handful of merchant vessels arriving each season. But if Salem had lost its wealth, it had not lost its ghosts. The townspeople lived among cemeteries older than the nation itself, their crooked headstones leaning at angles, their inscriptions half erased by time. The dead were everywhere in Salem, in the streets named for them, in the churches that still carried the scent of wax and dust, in the stories whispered from parent to child. And above all, in the memory of the witch trials that had stained the town's name nearly 150 years earlier. A town of shadows and silent, Salem in the 1840s was small, barely 15,000 souls. By day, its cobbled streets echoed with the sounds of horse carts and the cries of fishmongers selling their catch near the harbor. By night, it grew unnervingly still. Gas lamps burned faintly, their light swallowed by the damp fog that rolled in from the sea. Families shuttered their windows early. Conversations were hushed. Behind closed doors, people prayed by candlelight. The homes themselves were old and creaking, wooden frames blackened by salt air, doors warped by the sea's moisture. Most households still relied on firewood, their hearths filling the town with the smell of smoke. A chill clung to every room in Salem, even in summer. And in the fall, when the leaves turned and the winds sharpened, it was as if the very air of the town conspired to remind its people of death. The population was sternly religious. The majority descended from Puritan families, though many had softened into Unitarian or Congregationalist congregations. Yet even with more modern churches, the old fears lingered. Families spoke less of demons, but they spoke often of madness, of fits, of unexplainable sicknesses that no doctor could cure. To the people of Salem, the devil had not vanished. He had simply changed his mask. Fear of the mind. The 19th century was a time when mental illness was poorly understood. Doctors spoke of hysteria, nervous disorders, and female derangements with little knowledge of their causes. Women who wept uncontrollably, who raged or fainted or screamed, were often thought to be possessed, or worse, punished by God. Salem itself sat only miles from one of the most infamous institutions of the age, the McLean Asylum for the Insane, in nearby Charlestown. Patients there were said to shriek through the night, their cries drifting across the river like the howls of animals. For Salem's citizens, the line between madness and the supernatural was blurred, uncertain. So when one woman began screaming without end, the townspeople's minds reached quickly for explanations. Sin, demons, curses, or the restless legacy of Salem's past. The weight of history. No town in America bore a heavier burden of superstition than Salem. In 1692, its soil had been stained by the executions of 19 men and women, hanged for the crime of witchcraft. Another man was crushed to death under stones. Scores more languished in jails, their reputations destroyed, their families ruined. Though the trials had ended generations earlier, their memory clung to Salem like fog to the harbor. By the 19th century, children still grew up hearing stories of the Gallows Hill, of spectral evidence, of women who claimed to see visions and of neighbors who accused each other of sorcery. Old families carried shame in their names, for their ancestors had been among the accusers or the accused. So when the screams began in 1842, many did not hear simply the cries of one woman. They heard the voice of history itself, echoing forward through time. To them, it was as if the sins of Salem had returned to collect their debt. Daily life in 1842 Salem life in Salem was modest, disciplined, and often difficult. Families lived in small, drafty homes. Candles were expensive, so most lived in dim light after sunset. The average household ate bread, salted pork, and root vegetables. Fresh fruit was a luxury, and sugar was precious. Children worked from a young age, boys as apprentices in workshops, girls as seamstresses or maids in wealthier homes. Disease was common. Smallpox had ravaged the region in decades prior, and scarlet fever outbreaks still haunted towns like Salem. The cry of a sick child was an everyday sound. Death, too, was an everyday visitor. Graves filled quickly, and funerals were frequent. The people of Salem were accustomed to hardship, but they were not accustomed to one thing, a sound without end. For in the quiet nights of 1842, when the sea mist rolled in and the streets fell silent, every family expected to rest in peace, even if only for a few hours before dawn. The scream of the woman shattered that fragile peace like glass against stone. The first reactions at first, many residents told themselves it was temporary. Some whispered it was grief. The woman had lost her husband, her child, perhaps both. Others said it was madness, a brain fever that would pass when her body gave way. But as the days turned to weeks, patience eroded. The town watch received complaints. Merchants muttered about customers leaving Salem altogether. Church leaders debated whether to intervene, whether to treat the screams as a sickness of the mind or a curse upon the town. The situation grew dire when children began waking in terror, crying that they heard the woman's voice inside their dreams. Parents swore they too had begun to hear it even in silence, a phantom echo that seemed to seep into their very bones. The narrator pauses, tone tightening. This was the world of Salem in 1842. A small, fading town burdened by its past, haunted by superstition, and ill-prepared for what was to come. When the screaming began, it was not only the story of a single woman. It was the story of a community collapsing under the weight of fear, of religion, of history itself. And it was only the beginning. The music returns, low piano notes, steady and unsettling. The narration slows, as though turning the pages of an old archive. The story of Salem's endless scream is not only the story of a phenomenon, it is the story of people. Individuals whose lives became entangled in a mystery they could neither solve nor escape. The woman herself, her name, in the most reliable records, was Mary Elkins. 32 years old. Widow of a sailor named Thomas Elkins, lost to the sea in 1839 when his brig never returned from the Caribbean. Mary was described in her youth as a quiet, devout woman. Dark hair, pale skin, and eyes that neighbors remembered as startlingly clear, as though she were always listening to something distant. She lived modestly in a clapboard house near Charter Street, not far from the cemetery. She worked as a seamstress, taking in mending from local families. Her small earnings supplemented what little savings she had after her husband's disappearance. There were whispers that she sometimes wandered to the harbor at night, waiting by the water, convinced Thomas would one day return. Before the screaming began, Mary was seen as pitiable but harmless. A soul bruised by sorrow, one neighbor wrote. But when her voice turned to an endless shriek, pity twisted into fear. Witnesses described her body as thin, almost frail, but with a terrifying endurance. Her throat did not swell as expected, her lungs did not collapse. Instead, she seemed locked in some unnatural cycle. Inhale, scream, inhale, scream. Even when she collapsed from exhaustion, The moment her eyes opened, the sound began again. Some said her eyes changed, once a clear gray, now glassy, unblinking, as though she saw some figure standing always at her side. Reverend Josiah Burroughs. The first man called to intervene was Reverend Josiah Burroughs, minister of Salem's First Parish Church. A thin, sharp-faced man in his late 50s, Burroughs was known for his stern sermons and his distrust of modern scientific explanations. Burroughs had spent decades warning his congregation that sin and temptation lingered in every corner of life. The devil, he said, had not left Salem after the witch trials. He had merely gone underground, waiting for new vessels. When Burroughs first visited Mary Elkins, he brought with him a Bible and a flask of holy water. He attempted prayer, but the scream drowned out his words. He attempted hymns, but the sound shook the walls. Some accounts suggest he tried to force holy water between her lips, though others claim he fled after less than an hour, pale and trembling. In his sermon the following Sunday, Burroughs did not name Mary directly, but he spoke of a woman who has opened her mouth to hell, and from whose throat the cries of demons pour. His words cast a shadow of suspicion, and sealed Mary's fate in the eyes of many townspeople. Dr. Jonathan Hale. Where Burroughs saw demons, Dr. Jonathan Hale saw a medical mystery. Hale was 41, one of the few trained physicians in Salem, educated at Harvard Medical School. He was ambitious, eager to distinguish himself. To him, Mary's condition was not a curse, but an opportunity. Hale documented her case in meticulous notes, fragments of which survive today. He described her pulse as rapid but steady, her vocal cords as unmarred despite exertion beyond natural limits. He attempted sedation with laudanum. He attempted binding her jaw shut, which nearly suffocated her. He even experimented with bleeding, hoping the loss of vitality might force her body into silence. Nothing worked. Privately, Hale admitted he was unsettled. In one entry, he wrote, "Her cries reverberate beyond the walls of the house. At times I feel they do not merely enter the ear, but strike some hidden organ of the soul itself. I fear there is no medicine for such a malady." Despite his failures, Hale returned again and again, as though unable to resist the lure of the inexplicable. Samuel Pike, the neighbor. No story spreads without witnesses, and few were closer to Mary than Samuel Pike, the man who lived directly next door. A cobbler by trade, Pike was 45, a husband, and father of 2 children. His home shared a thin wooden wall with Mary's. That wall, he would later claim, became a drum for the scream. At first, he tried to show patience. He moved his children to the farthest room. He nailed blankets over the shared wall. But soon, his wife grew ill, plagued by headaches. His youngest began waking in the night, clutching her ears. Pike himself claimed he could hear the scream even while at work, pounding nails into shoes, as though the sound traveled through my blood. By mid-October, Pike had written to Salem's selectmen, demanding Mary be removed. When no action was taken, he began telling his neighbors that she was cursed, perhaps even a witch reborn from Salem's bloody history. His testimony would fuel panic in the weeks that followed. Elizabeth Ward, the friend not everyone abandoned Mary. Among the few who continued to visit her was Elizabeth Ward, a widow of 50 and one of Mary's oldest companions. The 2 women had attended the same sewing circle for years. Elizabeth claimed Mary had been unwell even before the screaming began. She spoke of sleepless nights, strange mutterings, and sudden fits of laughter or tears. Elizabeth believed Mary was not possessed but broken, a woman crushed by grief and isolation. Elizabeth tried to comfort her, bringing broth and sitting by her bed even as the scream tore the air. She wrote in her journal, "If I cover my ears and watch her face, I see not madness, but terror. It is as though she is trying to tell us something, though no words remain in her throat." Elizabeth would be one of the last friends to stand by her, though even she admitted, in her final entry, "I feel the sound now even in silence. It follows me into sleep." The children of Salem. Perhaps the most chilling accounts came not from ministers or doctors, but from the children of Salem. They were the most vulnerable, the most impressionable, and they were the first to claim that Mary's scream followed them into their dreams. One child, the son of Samuel Pike, awoke shrieking that he saw a woman with no mouth, only a hole that never closed. Another girl insisted that at school she could hear the scream under the teacher's voice, no matter how loudly the lesson was spoken. Parents tried to hush them, but the whispers spread. Soon the children began to draw crude sketches, figures of a woman with black hair and wide, glassy eyes, her mouth stretched impossibly wide. These drawings, passed between desks, only deepened the terror of their parents. The town as a character, and finally, there was Salem itself. A town with its own memory, its own scars. For in Salem, no horror could exist without the shadow of 1692 looming over it. As Mary screamed, the town seemed to respond. Shops closed earlier. Families moved away. The church bells rang emptier, their sound swallowed by the wail that drifted over rooftops. Even the harbor seemed quieter, as though the sea itself were listening. The people of Salem did not merely live beside Mary's cries, they lived inside them. The town itself became another character in her story, fearful, suspicious, and ultimately complicit in what was to come. The narrator's tone slows to a whisper. These were the figures bound to the fate of the woman who never stopped screaming, the widow at the center of it all. The minister who saw a demon. The doctor who saw an illness. The neighbor who saw a curse. The friend who saw only sorrow. And a town that saw its past return to life. Together, they formed the stage upon which Salem's darkest chapter would play out. And soon, their testimonies would ignite a storm. The sound of an old quill scratching paper. The narrator speaks slowly, as though reading from aged manuscripts. History is not written in thunder. It is written in whispers, in journals tucked beneath mattresses, in newspapers yellowed and forgotten in attic trunks. And when we look into the story of the woman who never stopped screaming, we find not only the echoes of her voice, but the echoes of those who heard it. The Journal of Samuel Pike, Neighbor, October 3rd, 1842, her cries began again before dawn. God preserve us. I tried stuffing the cracks of the wall with cloth, but it is useless. The sound enters regardless, like smoke. My wife weeps nightly. My youngest, and, will not eat. She shakes as though chilled even when wrapped in wool. It is not a natural sound. When I close my eyes, I feel it behind my ribs, striking like a hammer. I do not think she breathes between them. There are times I believe she has stopped, that she is dead, and yet the sound continues. We cannot live beside this thing much longer. She will drive us all to the grave. Salem Gazette, October 7, 1842. A disturbance on Charter Street. Residents of Charter Street and the surrounding lanes have in recent weeks been troubled by the continual cries of a certain widow. Despite the efforts of clergymen and physicians, the disturbance persists both by day and by night. The phenomenon has inspired fear and speculation among the townsfolk. Some believe the widow's affliction to be a visitation of madness. Others, that it is a judgment for past sins. The selectmen have not yet taken official action, though complaints multiply daily. Many families threaten to remove themselves from Salem should the condition not be resolved. The letter of Reverend Josiah Burroughs to a fellow minister, October 12, 1842, Brother in Christ. I write to you concerning an affliction most grievous. A woman of our town has become as one possessed, emitting a scream without ceasing. No force of will nor word of Scripture can silence her. I have prayed over her, but the sound drowned my tongue. I held the cross before her, but she looked through me as if to some other presence. The sound itself unnerves the spirit. It is not merely loud but unnatural, as though made not by flesh but by something that borrows flesh. It has begun to infect the minds of others. Already there are reports of children hearing it in their dreams, and men swearing they hear it even at sea. I fear we face not an illness but a curse. I ask your counsel, for if this continues, the very soul of Salem is imperiled. Elizabeth Ward's diary, October 14, 1842. I went again to see Mary. She lies thin upon her bed, her hands gripping the coverlet until her knuckles are white. Her scream does not falter. At times her chest seems to rise so little I fear she will perish, but then it swells again, and the scream pours forth. I tried humming to her. I thought perhaps a melody might soften it. but it only grew louder, as though to drown me out. Still, I will not abandon her. When I look at her eyes, I see a woman begging us to understand, even as her mouth betrays her. If I cover my ears, I see terror there. Something is being forced from her. I swear it. * Dr. Jonathan Hale's medical notes, October 19, 1842. * Patient continues to emit a piercing scream without pause, save for moments of collapse. Duration now exceeds 3 weeks. Throat tissue examined, no significant inflammation, contrary to expectation. Voice persists at full strength. Administered laudanum, ineffective. Attempted compression of the jaw resulted in suffocation distress, but sound returned once pressure removed. Observation: the sound cannot be wholly natural. At times it seems to emanate not solely from the throat but from the very walls of the chamber. I stood in the hall and felt the boards vibrate beneath my shoes, though she was in the adjoining room. Conclusion: cause unknown. No remedy apparent. Continued exposure to the sound causes headache, trembling, and in my own case, disturbed sleep. Recommend removal of patient from population to prevent further harm. * Testimony of Sarah Wilkins, age 11, recorded in Town Ledger, October 21, 1842. I hear her when I sleep. She stands at the end of my bed. She screams, but her mouth is not moving. Sometimes she holds a baby in her arms. Sometimes the baby is me. When I wake, I still hear her. Please tell her to stop. The Boston Evening Transcript, October 25, 1842. A curious phenomenon in Salem reports reached this city of a widow in Salem whose cries have continued without cease for near a month. Though physicians and ministers have intervened, no explanation has satisfied the citizenry. Some suspect hysteria, others supernatural cause. Travelers describe the sound as audible even at a mile's distance. Merchants claim business suffers, for many avoid Salem altogether. Residents petition for her confinement in Charlestown Asylum. Yet others warn against such action, fearing the cries will follow her wherever she is taken. The Journal of Elizabeth Ward, October 28, 1842. * I can no longer sleep. Even in silence, I hear her voice. It comes through the walls of my own house, through the wood of my bed. Last night I dreamt I opened my mouth to scream with her, and no sound came. Only blood. I fear she is dying, yet I fear more what will happen if she does not. * Town Meeting Notes, November 1, 1842. The question of Widow Elkins was raised. Several parties demand her removal from Charter Street. Others warn against provoking God's wrath. Reverend Burroughs insists she is possessed. Dr. Hale maintains a medical mystery. No consensus reached. Noted: the sound of her cries was faintly audible during the meeting itself, though Town Hall lies near half a mile from her home. Final entry of Samuel Pike, November 5, 1842. * We are leaving Salem. My children will not endure another night. The sound is in their bones. My wife swears she hears it even when she holds her ears underwater in the basin. If they will not silence her, we must flee. Let Salem keep its ghosts. The narrator pauses, silence, as though letting the weight of the testimonies sink in. Together, these fragments form a mosaic of dread, neighbors unraveling, ministers condemning, doctors baffled, children haunted, and a town drifting toward hysteria. The witnesses of Salem did not merely hear a scream. They lived inside it. And soon, their fear would take on a life of its own. By the autumn of 1842, the village of Salem had already been rattled by the unrelenting cries of Margaret Harlow. But what began as a single woman's torment soon spilled into something far larger, something that would grip the entire community in dread. The screaming was no longer confined to her small cottage. It seemed to crawl through the night air, seeping into dreams, haunting the minds of those who tried desperately to ignore it. At first, the townsfolk attempted to rationalize. Perhaps, they said, her suffering was an illness of the nerves. A woman so afflicted that her voice betrayed her body. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the village realized something dreadful. Margaret was not merely screaming. She was transforming the very fabric of their lives. The first death, it began with Jonathan Miles, a shoemaker whose home stood just 2 streets away from Margaret's. On the evening of September 13th, his wife awoke to find him gasping for air, his body drenched in sweat, his lips trembling as though he had just been startled from a nightmare. But Jonathan had not been dreaming. He whispered that he had heard her scream, not outside, not in the streets, but within their home. Before dawn broke, Jonathan was dead. His eyes, wide open, bore the unmistakable look of terror, as though he had seen something unspeakable in his final moments. No wound, no fever, no explanation. Just the echo of Margaret's cries in his ears. Word of his death spread quickly. Some villagers muttered that Jonathan had been cursed for mocking Margaret just days before. Others said he had been claimed by whatever force refused to release her. The infection of fear after Jonathan's death, Salem changed. Families barred their doors earlier than usual, extinguishing their lanterns long before midnight. Children were hushed to sleep not with lullabies, but with desperate pleas from their parents. Close your eyes, block your ears, do not listen for her. Merchants stopped traveling at night. Farmers began working their fields in uneasy silence, constantly glancing over their shoulders. The once bustling tavern grew quiet, its patrons whispering only of Margaret, of Jonathan, of what might come next. The fear spread like a sickness, and the screams, always the screams, seemed to grow louder. Some swore they could hear them carried by the wind even miles away from her cottage. Nightmares and madness. Not all who suffered perished immediately. Many reported a slow descent into madness. Rebecca Fields, a school teacher, confessed in her diary that she could no longer sleep without dreaming of Margaret's face, her mouth open in a scream that never ceased. Within weeks, Rebecca stopped teaching altogether. She wandered the streets, her eyes glassy, whispering, "She's in my head, she's in my head." Elias Turner, a farmer, told the local minister that every night, he heard the scream behind his barn. When he would rush outside with a lantern, there was nothing, only the faint sound of wind through the corn. One morning, Elias was found kneeling in his field, his ears stuffed with wax, blood trickling down from where he had tried to push it too deep. He claimed it was the only way to keep her out. Children, too, began waking in the night, shrieking in terror. One boy described seeing a pale woman at the foot of his bed, her mouth open, her voice somehow silent, until he woke, and the house was filled with a scream that no one else had heard. The contagion of sound. It was then that the townsfolk began to realize a terrifying truth. Margaret's torment was not isolated. Her screaming was no longer hers alone. Others had begun to mimic it. At first, just in short bursts, an involuntary cry, a sudden shout in the night. But soon, whole families reported hearing their own loved ones cry out with voices not their own. A blacksmith's apprentice was overheard screaming in perfect imitation of Margaret's voice, though he swore he remembered nothing. A farmer's wife collapsed in church after suddenly wailing so loudly that every candle flickered out. Some believed that the scream was contagious, that to hear it too long was to carry it within yourself. The ministers called it possession. The physicians called it hysteria. But the villagers called it something far worse, the spreading. The second death, the next tragedy, sealed their fears. Catherine Doyle, a young mother of 2, was walking home one evening when she vanished. Her body was found at dawn, just outside Margaret's cottage. Her hands were pressed tightly against her ears, as if she had been trying to block something out. Her mouth was open in a scream that had been frozen by death itself. The physician who examined her whispered that it was as though the sound had burst her heart from within. From then on, no one dared pass Margaret's home at night. Even in daylight, villagers crossed the street, their eyes fixed firmly on the ground. The cottage was not a place of pity anymore, it was a place of dread. The village in decline by winter, Salem was no longer the same town it had been. Businesses failed, fields went untilled, children went untaught. Families fled in the dead of night, abandoning their homes and wagons, leaving behind only silence and the screams. Those who remained lived in constant anticipation. Every creak of a door, every howl of the wind, every cry of an animal seemed to echo Margaret's unending voice. Salem had become a village not of people, but of listeners, listeners trapped in a nightmare they could not wake from. The tipping point. The town council, once determined to remain calm, now spoke openly of drastic measures. Some whispered of exorcism, others of burning her cottage to the ground. A few, in hushed tones, suggested the unthinkable, that Margaret herself must be silenced, by any means necessary. But whether by faith, fear, or guilt, no one dared act. For the moment anyone approached her door, her cries grew so piercing, so unearthly, that they staggered back in terror. And so Salem lived on the edge of collapse, one scream away from destruction. Narrator's pause. The story of Margaret Harlow was no longer a tale of one woman's suffering. It had become a plague of sound, an invisible hand that gripped Salem's heart tighter with each passing night. Death had come. Madness had taken root. And the people of Salem knew that what awaited them next would be far worse. By the early months of 1843, Salem had reached its breaking point. The endless wailing of Margaret Harlow had already claimed lives, eroded minds, and hollowed out the village's spirit. Fear had become the common language of the people. And yet, as the town teetered on the edge of collapse, there emerged a fragile sliver of hope, the men of reason. If religion, superstition, and communal will had failed, perhaps medicine or science might succeed. Or so they prayed. The arrival of Dr. Nathaniel Archer. The first to arrive was Dr. Nathaniel Archer, a physician of Boston, who had heard rumors of Margaret's affliction. Known for his curiosity about nervous disorders and his fascination with hysteria, Archer came to Salem with notebooks, scalpels, and the air of a man who believed in logic above all else. When he first encountered Margaret, he described her in his journal. The subject is a woman of 38 years, worn thin by sleeplessness, yet bearing a strange vitality. Her screams are not that of pain, nor madness, but of some ceaseless impulse, as though her body has become the instrument of an invisible hand. The sound is piercing, unnatural, and grows no weaker even after hours of exertion. She ought to collapse, and yet she endures. Dr. Archer attempted treatment by conventional means. He administered laudanum to sedate her, hoping the drug would bring her silence. But though her body slumped into unconsciousness, the scream did not cease. Her lips remained parted, her throat strained, and the cry poured forth as if detached from her will. Frightened but determined, Archer attempted to restrain her, placing cloth and instruments to study the mechanics of her throat. He recorded something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Her vocal cords moved, yes, but not with the rhythm of breathing or speech. They shuddered in unnatural spasms, as though driven by a power not her own. I held her pulse in my fingers. It slowed to a near stop under sedation, yet the scream continued at full force, utterly independent of her strength. Unable to reconcile this, Archer left Salem days later, pale and shaken, refusing to speak of what he had witnessed. The scholars of Harvard soon after, word spread to Harvard's Faculty of Natural Philosophy. 3 scholars, intrigued and skeptical, traveled to Salem with apparatus in tow. Brass instruments for measuring sound, tuning forks, and even a rudimentary device meant to capture vibrations in wax. They treated Margaret not as a patient, but as a specimen. One scholar recorded, her scream never falters, holding neither melody nor variation, yet registering across our instruments with unnatural consistency. It is not the cry of a woman, but of something sustained, as if the sound has no source. When they tried to measure the frequency of her cry, the results baffled them. The pitch was consistent, but their instruments cracked, warped, and even shattered when brought too close. One fork split clean down the middle after mere seconds of exposure. The scholars left Salem in disgrace. They wrote no official papers, offered no explanations. Among the villagers, it was said they departed trembling, whispering that Margaret's voice was not of this world. The priest's attempt by spring, the desperation of Salem turned to the church. Father Abel Whitcomb, a stern minister known for his fiery sermons, believed Margaret to be possessed by demonic influence. Where science had failed, perhaps faith might prevail. In March, he entered her cottage with a Bible, a crucifix, and a small group of parishioners who sang hymns to drown out her cries. But the moment the priest began his rites, something extraordinary occurred. Margaret's scream changed. It grew sharper, louder, vibrating the walls of the cottage. The crucifix in his hand rattled violently. The flame of every candle blew out. And though Whitcomb shouted prayers over her, Margaret's scream rose to such a pitch that those present clutched their heads and fell to their knees, blood seeping from their ears. The priest staggered out hours later, his hands shaking, his faith shaken. If this be the work of demons, he confessed to the townsfolk, then it is of a kind far beyond any I have known. For no prayer reached her, and no God heard me there. The failed operation not long after, a final and more desperate attempt was made. Dr. Elias Pritchard, a surgeon with a reputation for boldness, proposed that Margaret's throat itself might be the culprit. If her vocal cords were removed or severed, perhaps the sound would cease. Though many balked at the cruelty, some of the town's leaders agreed. They reasoned that Margaret's suffering was endless, and that such a procedure might grant her, and Salem, peace. On the evening of April 12th, Dr. Pritchard entered Margaret's cottage with his tools. Witnesses outside claimed her screams suddenly cut off, for the very first time in months. But the silence lasted only moments. When Pritchard stumbled out, his face white as bone, he dropped his blooded instruments to the ground. His voice trembled as he told the crowd, "Her throat is ruined, her cords severed, yet still she screams." And indeed, from within the cottage, her cry rang out once more, unchanged, unbroken, eternal. The aftermath of science, the attempts of doctors, scholars, and priests had proven worse than futile. They had stripped Margaret of dignity, injured her body, risked their own sanity, and the scream endured. The people of Salem began to whisper what none dared say aloud, that Margaret was no longer entirely human, that whatever had claimed her voice had consumed her whole. No physician would return after Pritchard. No priest volunteered another exorcism. And no scholar dared risk their reputation again. Salem was left with its horror intact, abandoned by reason itself. Narrators pause. In the end, science did not silence Margaret. If anything, its failures made the terror greater. For what human affliction could withstand drugs, surgery, and prayer? What earthly explanation could account for a scream that outlived the body it came from? The villagers of Salem could no longer comfort themselves with hope. They could no longer pretend this was an illness, or a curse, or a madness. It was something else. Something that had taken root in Margaret Harlow. And as spring gave way to summer, Salem braced for the inevitable. For they knew the worst was yet to come. The year was drawing toward its end, and Salem had become a hollow echo of the town it once was. Crops withered in the fields, shops stood abandoned, and at dusk, the streets fell silent. The only sound that remained constant, eternal, unrelenting, was Margaret Harlow's scream. But in the summer of 1843, something shifted. It began subtly, with changes in the sound itself. The scream no longer stayed steady, but wavered. It grew jagged, bending in pitch, sometimes splintering into two tones at once, like the voice of more than one being. And with every change, Salem braced itself, as if waiting for the world to finally break. The night of the gathering on July 2nd, the town council, weary and desperate, convened one last time. Enough, they said. Salem could not endure another season under her spell. They resolved to act, not as scientists or priests, but as villagers defending their very survival. They would gather at Margaret's cottage, all of them, armed with fire and rope. If she was possessed, they would drive it out. If she was cursed, they would end it. And if she was no longer a woman but something else entirely, they would destroy it. That night, a crowd of nearly the entire village assembled outside her home. Men carried torches. Women clutched rosaries and hymn books. Children huddled at the edges, forbidden from looking, but unable to turn away. And from inside the cottage, her voice thundered on, shrill and piercing, as though she already knew what they had come to do. Breaking down the door, the strongest among them forced the door open, splintering the wood. The moment the threshold cracked, her scream surged to a volume so violent that the nearest windows shattered outward. Men staggered back, covering their ears. Several dropped their torches into the dirt. But they pressed on, stepping into the small, dimly lit room. Margaret sat where she always had, in the wooden chair near the hearth, her body frail, her face pale as wax. But her mouth was no longer human. It was open wider than bone and skin should allow, her jaw stretched, her throat an endless pit of vibrating shadow. Her scream filled the space, rattling the beams of the cottage. One man fell to his knees, vomiting blood. Another collapsed entirely, his eyes rolling white. Yet still they advanced, clinging to courage born of desperation. The attempted execution, they bound her to the chair with rope, though she made no movement to resist. The scream never broke. It poured from her as constant as breath, her eyes staring blankly forward, unblinking. The council leader, a man named Thomas Greaves, raised his hand to the crowd. "This ends tonight," he said. His voice trembled, yet his grip on the torch was firm. He lowered the flame to the straw and kindling piled at Margaret's feet. Fire leapt quickly, swallowing the chair legs, curling upward. The villagers braced themselves, expecting the scream to falter, for pain to overtake her. But instead, something impossible occurred. The scream grew louder, so loud that the flames themselves seemed to bend backward, snuffed and pushed away by the sheer force of sound. The fire sputtered, then extinguished entirely, leaving only smoke. Margaret did not burn. The shattering panic overtook the room. Some fled, crashing into the night. Others fell into prayer, shrieking scripture over her cries. And then it happened. Margaret's voice, or what had once been her voice, split into many. From her mouth erupted not one scream but dozens, hundreds, layered atop one another, a chorus of anguish. Men clutched their skulls as the air seemed to crack like glass. The walls of the cottage began to splinter, beams groaning under pressure. Windows burst outward with sharp reports. Birds fell dead from the sky above. Witnesses outside said the ground itself trembled, as though the very earth recoiled from the sound. The final sight through it all, Margaret's body remained still, save for her jaw, distended into the void of her throat. But as the house shook and the people wailed, something began to emerge. Villagers swore they saw shadows spilling from her mouth, writhing shapes with no form, smoke that moved as though alive. Faces flickered in the dark mist, faces twisted in agony, mouths frozen wide in screams of their own. Some claimed they recognized them. Jonathan Miles, Catherine Doyle, and others who had perished since her affliction began. The shadows rushed outward, dispersing into the night, their cries blending with hers until the world seemed made of nothing but screams. And then, silence. The house collapsed inward, beams snapping, the roof caving down. Dust rose into the night. When it cleared, Margaret was gone. The aftermath, the villagers searched the ruins. They found no body, no bones, not even ash. Only the chair remained, blackened but intact, its ropes frayed as if burned from the inside. For the first time in over a year, Salem slept in silence. But silence, they discovered, could be worse than sound. The haunting echo days later, those who had been present began to report strange sensations. At night, they swore they heard faint cries just beyond their windows. Sometimes, when speaking, their own voices quivered, a tone of Margaret's scream slipping into their words. Children who had been there claimed they dreamed of her, sitting in her chair, mouth still open, screaming in silence as shadows passed through her lips. And within weeks, 3 more villagers were dead. Their bodies found in bed, mouths open wide, eyes fixed in terror, as if they had joined the chorus. Narrators pause. The villagers had tried everything. Medicine, prayer, fire. They had seen shadows escape into the night, had heard screams beyond the edge of human ability, and in the end, they were left with nothing but a memory that refused to fade. The woman who never stopped screaming had vanished. But Salem would never escape her. For some horrors do not die when the body does. They linger, as the ruins of Margaret Harlowe's cottage were left to rot. No one dared rebuild on the land. Grass overtook the foundation, the stones scattered and buried by seasons of snow and rain. The villagers avoided the site, crossing the road rather than pass too near. Children were warned to keep away, though some whispered that, at night, If you placed your ear to the ground, you could still hear her cries faintly, as though trapped beneath the earth. But the silence that followed her disappearance was not a relief. It was a silence that pressed in, suffocating, waiting. The villagers soon realized that silence can be a sound in itself, one that carries memory. And Margaret's scream was not gone. It was waiting. The lingering fear in the months after, Salem grew quieter still. Families who had fled never returned. Those who remained carried with them the weight of a haunting. Even years later, journals, sermons, and stray letters tell the same story. That people heard cries in the wind on stormy nights. That livestock startled at nothing, their ears twisting as if catching a noise unheard by others. That newborns sometimes wailed with a pitch eerily close to Margaret's own scream, before falling silent, as though exhausted by something too large for their small lungs. The sound, they said, had seeped into the land itself. The generational curse by the turn of the next generation. Whispers grew darker. Grandchildren of those who had lived through the terror began reporting. Nightmares of a woman in a chair, mouth open wider than the body should allow, her eyes unblinking. Some woke with hoarse throats, roar as though they themselves had been screaming in their sleep. Others claimed that, once every decade or so, the scream returned. Not for long, never for days on end, but in short bursts. A single night when the village would fall still, the air carrying a faint, piercing cry from nowhere. It always vanished by dawn. Yet every time, an elder, a child, or a mother would be found dead within the week. Their faces frozen in terror, their mouths wide open. The scholars return in the late 1800s, nearly 50 years after Margaret's disappearance. A small group of scholars returned to Salem, seeking to examine the legend. They took soil samples, sketched the ruins of the cottage, and interviewed the surviving elders. What they found unsettled even them. Instruments designed to measure vibration recorded faint frequencies in the air, inaudible to human ears. At the ruins, their devices spiked wildly, registering noise where there was none. One of the scholars, in his private notes, wrote, "It is as if the earth itself hums with her cry, a sound beneath sound, too low for the ear, but not for the soul." Their findings were never published. The men left Salem abruptly and spoke no more of their work. The mystery endures today. The story of Margaret Harlow survives only in fragments. Parish records, fading diary entries, folklore passed from mouth to mouth. Some historians dismiss it as hysteria, a mass delusion born of isolation and fear. Others argue it was a medical phenomenon, perhaps epilepsy, perhaps something akin to what we now call catatonia or psychogenic disorder. But those who live near Salem's old grounds say differently. They insist the place is not quiet at all. They say that on certain nights, when the fog is thick and the air carries no wind, the silence itself changes. It deepens. It becomes heavy. And if you listen too closely, you might hear it. A faint scream. Distant. Endless. Growing closer. Narrator's closing pause. The woman who never stopped screaming may have vanished into the earth, or into shadow, or into the imagination of a people gripped by fear. But one truth remains. Her voice never truly died. Perhaps it lives still, buried in the soil of Salem. Perhaps it waits in the darkness of forgotten rooms. Or perhaps, even now, it has found another mouth, another victim, another vessel. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some screams are not meant to end. And so the question lingers, haunting and unresolved. What truly happened to Margaret Harlow, and what, if anything, still carries her scream? Eaching for another mouth to call home.